So a Texas rig is one of the widest used techniques in bass fishing, and along my journey there's been a few things that I've learned, and that includes a couple of the different knots that I like to throw in different situations, and also at the end I'll talk about why you might be losing fish on a Texas rig, and I'll break that down as well. So if that sounds like something that's going to affect you or piques your interest, stick around, you're not going to want to miss this video. So when you're first learning to bass fish, a Texas rig plays immensely pretty much everywhere. It's one of the first things that we all learn how to do. You put a weight on a hook and then a hook below it, you put a bait on there and you go do whatever, and you can catch fish no matter what baits you put on there, no matter how you fish it, no matter the knots, the hooks, etc. You're gonna get bites, and it's a good way to be interactive. But I've learned a couple different knots that I like to use that really change how a Texas rig fishes and your landing ratio with a Texas rig. Because as a recreational angler, a lot of people don't notice the minuscule things, but to me at the end of a tournament day, if I lose 1 or 2 fish, that can play really, really big dividends or cost me a lot of money. And so that's something that I have to pay attention to. And so the first one that we'll talk about is just your standard Texas rig. We're down here in Florida right now, we got birds going nuts everywhere. And so the first Texas rig that I have, you'll see I have it pegged on there. I have tied just a San Diego jam knot on here. And you might be asking why I tied a San Diego jam knot. Because when I'm fishing this Texas rig with this worm, I'm casting it out. And it's gonna be a Texas rig in which I'm gonna feel the bite, I'm gonna reel down, I'm gonna set the hook from a distance. That fish isn't gonna be anywhere in front of me, it's gonna be somewhere out past me for the most part. And so when I'm doing that, that fish is gonna have a chance to eat it, and it's more likely my line is going to be more horizontal than vertical. And that's really, really important, because that's why I'm tying that San Diego jam knot. It's not gonna affect that hook at all, it's not gonna affect the way that worm sinks at all, it's just gonna be right there. And again, I have it pegged with an offset worm hook, so that way it rigs up well on a Texas rig, but an offset worm hook works really great for Carolina rig baits, like you know, your bigger creature baits, your beaver style baits that all go on a Texas rig. But that is the first knot that I'm gonna use, and you might be saying, well, that's nothing new. Well, hear me out. That's gonna be one that I like to use on fluorocarbon. I'm not a big braid guy with that. So the next knot that I wanna talk about is a snell knot. And you'll notice when I pull up on this, you'll see it kicks that hook out. And so the snell knot, what it does is instead of being tied on top of the hook, you can see it's actually through the eye of the hook and on the shank of that hook. And it does exactly what I just talked about. It kicks that hook up. And this is something that I like to do when I'm flipping a Texas rig, anytime I'm fishing close quarters. Because again, that's going to kick that hook right out, and it's gonna put it into the roof of that fish's mouth. That's important because if I'm fishing close quarters, I wanna have the best opportunity to land those fish. And if you set the hook, a lot of times, if you just have a snell knot or any other straight knot that's not gonna kick that hook out, it's gonna have a potential for that hook to roll in that fish's mouth, and you're gonna lose fish. And it might not be a lot of fish, but again, it's gonna be 1 or 2 fish per day. And so with this, when it kicks that hook up, it hooks them right in the roof of the mouth or right on the bottom jaw every single time. And because I have braid to a straight shank hook, I have this really wide gap on here. This is a Trokar flipping hook right here. So with that wide gap, it catches a hold of the meat, and you get a solid hook set on that. And you can do that with fluorocarbon too. It's not specifically a braid technique, but again, I do that when I'm close quarter fishing. Now, I don't do this when I'm fishing out away from me, because again, I'm not gonna have the power or the leverage, and a lot of times my hook set is gonna be, again, more horizontal. It's gonna be further away, and so kicking that hook out is not gonna be as big of an issue. So that's super important to differentiate between those 2 knots. What I want to talk about next is the rods you are fishing with your Texas rig. This is going to start to play into where people start to lose fish on a Texas rig. When it comes to anytime I'm throwing a straight shank hook like I just showed you, I like to have a stiffer rod. Anytime that I'm using a big single hook that has a wide gap like that, especially if I'm snelling it, I like to have a heavy action rod or an extra heavy action rod. It's just something that I'm gonna get a lot of power on that hook set. I'm gonna drive that hook home. It's gonna catch a lot of meat, and I'm gonna be able to wind that fish back to the boat. Now, if I'm fishing a Texas rig where I am casting it more, you know, that one I showed you with this Z-Man bang stick on here, that's gonna be something where I'm gonna go to more of a medium heavy. This is actually an Arc Essence medium mag heavy. And what that is, it has a softer tip, but it has more backbone. Because a lot of people, when they lose fish on a Texas rig, they either are using too soft of a rod that doesn't drive that hook home, and so what happens is you'll lose the fish on the first jump. We've all been there. You set the hook, think you get a great hook set, fish comes up, jumps once, pops right off. And you're left here sitting going, what in the heck? Well, it's because your rod was too soft. The next thing is it has a lot of backbone. Now, if you're a guy that loses fish on the way back to the boat, that's because your rod is too stiff with a Texas rig. And that's where the medium part comes into play in this medium mag heavy, because you get a great hook set on those fish, but as they come toward you, your rod doesn't have enough bend to load up on those fish and actually be able to fight those fish and give them the cushion they need to keep that hook pinned, but yet bring them to the boat. And that's why you see a lot of guys lose fish. They also lose fish because of the reel that they are throwing. It's a standard rule of thumb that if you're using slower moving baits, you want to go with a higher speed reel. And if you're going with baits you're constantly reeling, you can go with a slower gear ratio reel. So the problem that a lot of people run into with a Texas rig is they try to go out there with their standard 6:4 gear ratio reel, or even a 7:1 gear ratio reel. And as they cast it, fish eats it, set the hook, fish come towards them, and they just can't keep up, because they're used to throwing crankbaits or chatterbaits on that 6:4, and there's nothing wrong with that. But as you get into Texas rigging where you're flipping, a lot of times those fish can whoop you because they're just faster than you can reel. And that plays a lot of times, and I see it happen all over the place with guys, and it makes me laugh every time I see it. Now, the one thing that you want to note is I throw a 7:1 a lot. It's a pretty fast gear ratio reel for me, but if I am flipping open water and I'm doing nothing around cover, I'm flipping maybe light laydowns, I'm pitching a Texas rig down the bank, you know, just casting a Texas rig, I'll go to an 8:1 gear ratio reel, because that allows me to catch up to those fish extremely fast, which is super, super important. I don't like to go to an 8:1 gear ratio reel when I'm fishing around cover, because you lose torque in your reel the higher the gear ratio you go. So I end up going to a 7:1, because then I get a lot of power out of my reel without having to sacrifice the speed as much. So let's talk about a couple of my favorite baits with a Texas rig. The first of which is going to be obviously a Senko style bait, or a stick worm. This is a Z-Man Bang Stick, of course. That is an all-around great fish catcher. We're down here in Florida right now, hence the black and blue. The next is going to be your craw style baits. This is, again, a Z-Man Palmetto Bug, one of my absolute favorites. And you might be asking me why I'm referencing a lot of Z-Man baits. I do work with Z-Man very closely. We are partnered together, but I also love Z-Man baits for the Elastec, and I like that they float. So a lot of times when you pitch a Texas rig, if it's sediment or soft bottom, your bait will sink into the mud, versus these Elastec baits float up. And so they give those fish an idea where the bait is a little bit easier, and you can actually catch those fish a lot easier because they're gonna be able to see that bait from further away, and especially if you're around sediment or anything like that. But, so you have your beaver style or your cross style baits is another great one. If you're down here in Florida or around grass, you have your swimming style worms. This is a Z-Man Turbo Worm. Great option. And then you also have your Carolina rig style baits, your big creature baits. That's going to be something like your gremlins, your brush hogs, that kind of thing. Those are going to be your bigger style baits. And another thing that I want to talk about is going to be whether or not to peg your Texas rig. That's something that people talk about a lot, and it gets a lot of guff, because there's a lot of guys that are like, I only peg it, and there's a lot of guys that are like, I never peg it. And so the reason to peg your weight is going to be if you're fishing around cover. If you are fishing where you're casting into grass, you're casting into cattails, you're casting into wood, laydowns, something where you want all of that to be connected, that's when you peg it. If you are just going down the bank flipping a rocky bank, you're flipping, sparse laydowns, something that your bait is not going in and out of, by all means, throw no peg, because without a peg, it's gonna have a lot more action. If you're flipping, light reed heads or something like that, sparse grass, by all means, it's gonna give your bait more action, and it's gonna fish in a completely different way, because your weight will hit the bottom first, and then your bait will fall down, and you'll kind of get that slow fall rate, and you'll actually get a lot more bites because of it. If you guys want to know more about how to fish a speed worm, I'll have a video linked up here where I think you guys that fish around grass are really going to want to see that. But thank you guys so much for watching. God bless, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.